My father-in-law brought a 23-year-old woman to Thanksgiving dinner and announced she'd be staying at the family cottage indefinitely. For 4 days, neither of them emerged from the guest wing. Every night, I heard crying through the walls of that old Muskoka property. Soft at first, then desperate. When Hugh finally broke the door down, the truth inside didn't just rewrite everything we thought we knew about Edmund. It exposed the person who had actually been tearing this family apart, one carefully worded suggestion at a time. Our family's Thanksgiving table has always been a study in managed tension. The Beaumont Cottage on 3 Mile Lake has hosted 40 years of holiday dinners. The same chips-ceramic serving dishes, the same smell of roasting squash and beeswax candles, the same rhythm of the lake slapping against the dock outside. Margaret, my mother-in-law, died in February after a long illness. She spent her final 3 months in the downstairs bedroom of the main cottage, the one with the French doors that open onto the water. Since she passed, no one had touched that room. Edmund had asked us all to come up for the long weekend. Hugh and I drove 3 hours from Oakville. Stephanie and Warren arrived in their Tesla, Warren carrying a bottle of Niagara Peninsula Chardonnay he'd mentioned twice on the phone beforehand. When we pulled in, the dock lights were already on, the birch trees had gone gold, and the air smelled like wood smoke and cold water. It should have been peaceful. Edmund came in through the side door carrying 2 bags. Behind him was a young woman I had never seen before. She was slim, with dark hair pulled back, wearing a plain gray sweater and carrying a canvas tote that looked like it had been washed too many times. She kept her eyes on the floor. "This is Juniper," Edmund said, setting the bags on the bench by the door. "She'll be staying on in the guest wing for a while." Stephanie set her wine glass down with a sharp click. "Who is she?" "A friend," Edmund said. "That's all I'll say right now. Sit down, and I'll explain." He didn't explain. Not really. He told us that Juniper had been one of the home care nurses who helped during Margaret's last months, that she had nowhere safe to go right now, that he was offering her the guest suite as a temporary arrangement. When Stephanie asked if this was romantic, Edmund looked at her steadily and said, "I'm asking you to trust me." Hugh glanced at me across the table. I'd been a CPA for 12 years, 6 of them doing forensic accounting work for a firm in downtown Toronto. I was used to reading the gap between what numbers showed and what they actually meant. I looked at Edmund. The slight tremor in his left hand, the deliberate way he chose each word, the quick glance he gave toward the closed French doors of the downstairs bedroom before answering anything. This wasn't an infatuated old man showing off a young girlfriend. Something else entirely was going on. Warren was the one who framed it. He always was. "Edmund," he said, his voice carrying exactly the right measure of concern. Measured, warm, professionally calibrated. "I want to be sensitive here. But Stephanie and Hugh should know, if this woman is going to be living under this roof, there are estate planning implications that need to be addressed. Margaret's will went through probate in April. If a new partner is introduced before certain provisions are finalized." He paused, just long enough. "I just think you'd want full transparency." Stephanie looked at her husband, then at her father. Her eyes had gone wet. "You just buried Mom 8 months ago," she said quietly. Edmund stood up. "The soup is getting cold." That was the last real conversation we had with him that weekend. He and Juniper disappeared into the guest wing after dinner. The next morning, the door was locked. Dot, who looked after the property through the off-season, left a tray outside at noon, oatmeal, orange juice, 2 small cups of medication. Edmund collected it. The door closed again. Stephanie stood in that hallway for a long time. "She's got him completely turned around," she said to Warren that night, when she thought I wasn't nearby. Warren put his arm around her and said gently, "We just have to make sure you're protected." I heard it from the kitchen. I wrote it down in the notes app on my phone. People who are genuinely trying to protect someone rarely need to announce it that often. By the 3rd night, the crying was harder to ignore. It wasn't the sound of someone performing grief. It was low and effortful, the kind of crying you do when you're exhausted and trying to be quiet and failing. Hugh stood in the hallway at 2 in the morning, arms crossed, jaw tight. "It could be anything," I told him. "She could be grieving. She worked with your mother for months. Or he's keeping her in there against her will. Does that sound like the man who taught you to canoe?" He didn't answer, but the fear was understandable. From the outside, nothing about this looked clean. An older man, a woman 45 years younger, a locked room. I'd noticed that morning that the camera covering the guest wing's exterior side door had been angled up toward the trees. It hadn't been positioned that way in August, when we'd last been up. Warren noticed it too. He pulled Hugh aside and said, very calmly, I think we need to consider calling someone. A non-emergency police line, maybe. If something is happening in there, we could be legally liable for not acting. Hugh was ready to break the door down on the spot. I stopped him. If you go in there without knowing what's actually happening, you turn it into a confrontation. Give me a day. Hugh gave me a day. I called the property insurance company and asked about the security system audit log for the cottage. Legitimate enough. I was listed as an authorized contact on the Beaumont family account. The representative told me the cameras covering the main living areas were fully functional. The guest wing exterior camera had been redirected manually, not malfunctioned. The side door log showed it had been opened twice in the past 48 hours from the inside. Both times, the log showed a second person's keycard was used simultaneously. Juniper had her own keycard. She had used it herself. If she were being held against her will, she wouldn't need a keycard. She'd already used it twice, once at 7 in the morning, and once at 11 at night. I sat with that for a long time. That evening, I walked around to the side of the cottage to check the garden hose hookup. Plausible enough reason to be outside in the dark. Through the narrow window of the guest wing, I could see the edge of the room. A bed with extra pillows. A small side table crowded with prescription bottles. A blood pressure cuff draped over a chair. And on the nightstand, a framed photograph I recognized immediately. The same one from the upstairs hallway. Margaret and Edmund at their 30th anniversary, standing on this very dock. Juniper had placed it there herself. She hadn't been given it. She had brought it. I went back inside and found Warren in the kitchen, on his phone, speaking very quietly. He ended the call when he heard me come in. Just work, he said, and smiled. I said, of course, and went upstairs. But I'd already seen the number on his screen. It was the same area code as the collections adjacent firm I'd seen appear on some of our corporate correspondence that fall. The kind of company that floats near OSC proceedings like a pilot fish near a shark. I kept that to myself. On the fourth night, the crying turned into something else. I was in the upstairs bedroom, going through the Q3 reports Edmund had asked me to review. He still kept me looped in on the family business finances, when I heard it. A sharp, ragged sound, almost a gasp. Then a thud. Then Juniper's voice, muffled by two walls, I can't, please. And Edmund's voice, urgent in a way I had never once heard from him, stay still, look at me, I've got you. Hugh was out of bed before I could move. He ran down the hallway. I was right behind him. Stephanie appeared at the top of the stairs. Warren was a half step behind her, holding his phone. Hugh pounded on the guest wing door. Dad, open up, right now. No answer. Another low-pained sound from inside, not crying anymore, something more visceral. Warren said, very quietly to Stephanie, this is what I was afraid of. The timing of that sentence. The measured calm of it, as though it had been prepared. I looked at him, his eyes weren't on the door. They were on Stephanie, watching her react. Hugh grabbed the cast iron fire extinguisher bracket from the hallway wall, the old, mounting bracket that had been there since the cottage was built in the 70s, and used the base of it to cave in the doorframe around the lock. 2 strikes, the wood split, the door swung open. Juniper was on the bed, curled on her side, face gray, hands clenched into the blanket. Edmund was kneeling beside her, one hand on her back, the other pressing a folded towel to her forearm, where she'd knocked a glass over reaching for her medication in a rush. The nightstand was a mess. Pill bottles, a pulse oximeter, a half-full glass of water that had tipped. The blood pressure monitor was still attached to her other arm, beeping with steady red urgency. Edmund looked up at us. He didn't look like a man caught doing something shameful. He looked like a man who had been running on no sleep for 4 days and had just run out of road. She's stable, he said. She has a clotting disorder. The medication causes episodes. It's not. He stopped. He pressed his eyes shut for a single moment. Sit down, all of you, please. Warren stayed in the doorway. His eyes moved quickly around the room. The medication, the medical file on the dresser, the photograph of Margaret on the nightstand, and something shifted in his expression. Not relief. Something more like recalculation. Edmund told us everything. Juniper had been Margaret's primary home care nurse through the last 4 months of her illness. Margaret, private, stubborn, never asking for more than she absolutely had to, had slowly come to trust her, and, in those late-night hours when the rest of the family was asleep and the pain made conversation the only way to stay present, Margaret had learned what Juniper's life actually looked like. Her parents had died when she was 16. She'd been placed with a cousin named Morris, who had spent the years since gradually isolating her, controlling her income as a care worker, and using her wages to service his own debts. He had her sign documents she wasn't allowed to read. He held her original identification. When she tried to leave, he told her she owed him years of housing and support costs, a number that grew conveniently every time she made a move toward independence. Margaret had listened to all of it. And then, 6 days before she died, she had asked Edmund to sit with her. She said to me, Edmund's voice had gone very quiet. Ed, that girl has no one. She's going to disappear back into that situation the minute I'm gone. I need you to make sure that doesn't happen. He had promised. Hugh sat down on the floor of the hallway, back against the wall. I sat beside him. Why didn't you just tell us? Stephanie asked. Her voice had lost all its sharpness. She sounded genuinely lost. Edmund looked at his daughter for a long moment, because I knew how it would look. An old man bringing home the young woman who nursed his dying wife. I thought if I explained it, you would still see what you expected to see. I was going to wait until the legal protections were in place. The trust, the formal documentation. I thought I could keep her safe until the paperwork was done. And instead, Hugh said quietly, you made it look worse every single day. Edmund nodded. I know that now. Juniper had not said a word. She lay watching the family with the careful stillness of someone who has learned that taking up space usually costs something. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely there. I told him to send me away, back in September. She looked at the photograph on the nightstand. I told him it wasn't worth what it was doing to his family. A pause. He said he'd made a promise to her. I had to leave the room for a minute after that. I stood in the hallway, breathing through my nose, listening to the lake outside. Margaret had known. She had seen this young woman, really seen her in the hours when the rest of us were too frightened to go into that room at all. And her final act of care for her husband hadn't been asking him to grieve in a specific way. It had been asking him to carry forward something she couldn't finish herself. The lie he'd built to protect that promise had nearly destroyed everything. When I came back in, Warren was speaking. He had moved further into the room and was holding the medical file from the dresser, turning it in his hands with an air of polite concern. Edmund, he said, the priority now has to be managing how this looks. The company's Q4 investor review is coming up. If any of this becomes a matter of public record, a legal filing, a contested matter, it could affect the board's confidence in Hugh's leadership. I think the cleanest solution is a temporary transfer of your voting shares to Hugh and Stephanie jointly, just until everything is resolved. He glanced at Juniper briefly. It's just good governance. Edmund looked at him. The company is fine. Of course it is. But there's also the question of the caretaker provision in Margaret's will. Juniper is named. If she makes a claim, that becomes a contested probate proceeding, and those drag on for years. The simpler fix. Stop. Warren stopped. It was my voice. Everyone looked at me. You knew about the caretaker provision, I said, before this weekend. Warren smiled. Margaret's will is a matter of probate record. No. But you told Stephanie in August that there were no unusual provisions. I was there when she asked you. You said the estate was clean and straightforward. Stephanie turned to look at her husband very slowly. Warren said, I may have been summarizing. Nina's right, Hugh said quietly from the hallway floor. He had been listening. You were protecting a strategy, I said. If Juniper is discredited, if she looks like a predator, if the family turns against her, if Edmund can be shown to have been manipulated, the caretaker provision could be challenged on the grounds of undue influence. If the estate goes into a contested proceeding, there would be grounds to argue for an interim administration arrangement, which you would offer to manage. The room was completely still. That's an extraordinary accusation, Warren said. I spoke to Stuart, our family lawyer, 3 days ago, I said, about something unrelated. But I mentioned that we were coming up to the cottage and that there'd been some family friction. He told me something he'd been sitting on. He'd received a call in September from a financial advisor, unnamed, asking hypothetically about the process for challenging a caretaker provision in an Ontario estate. He remembered it because the hypothetical was unusually specific. Stephanie's hand rested flat on the dresser. Stuart would have records of that call, I said. And there are some financial records I've also been looking at. Warren, your portfolio advisory firm has been under OSC review since the spring. You have a margin call coming due in 6 weeks that you can't service from your own accounts. And 2 weeks ago, $8,000 moved from one of your numbered companies to the wife of the property caretaker, who manages the security system logs for this cottage. The silence changed quality entirely. Hugh stood up from the floor. You paid someone to pull the security data, Hugh said. You were going to use it to make it look like Dad was holding her here, against her will. And then you were going to step in as the reasonable voice and say we needed an interim arrangement for the estate. And Stephanie would sign it, because she trusts you. Warren looked at his wife. For the first time that weekend, his composure had a crack in it. Stephanie slid her wedding ring off her finger. The small sound it made against the dresser surface was the quietest thing in that room, and the loudest. Get out, she said. Don't speak on my behalf again. Don't speak for this family again. Warren picked up his briefcase and walked out. No one called after him. The side door closed. A minute later, we heard the Tesla pull out of the gravel drive. Morris arrived the next morning. He'd driven up from Barrie. Someone had tipped him off that the situation was breaking open, and he'd come to collect before it closed. He sat down in the main room of the cottage wearing a new jacket that didn't quite fit, holding a manila placeholder of documents Juniper had supposedly signed authorizing him to act as her financial representative. Stuart was on speakerphone within 15 minutes. Juniper identified 3 of the documents as things she'd signed without being allowed to read them. One had been handed to her in a hospital waiting room. Another she'd signed during a medication period that caused significant cognitive impairment. Her medical records from that month confirmed it clearly. Morris tried twice to make noise about the security logs, about Edmund's locked door, about the disabled camera. Each time, I slid the property insurance audit records across the table. Juniper's keycard usage, the timestamps, the fact that the camera had been redirected manually by someone with exterior access to the mounting hardware. Not by Edmund at all. Morris left an hour later with less than he'd arrived with. Stuart's follow-up letter went out that afternoon. The OSC referral regarding Warren's activities was filed the following week. The Law Society received a separate complaint. We didn't follow every thread of what happened after. Some things you hand off and let the right institutions handle. What I know is that the margin call he couldn't cover didn't get covered. Stephanie sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after Morris left. I brought her tea and sat across from her and didn't say anything until she was ready. I kept asking him to protect me, she said finally, and he was exactly the one I needed protecting from. I didn't say I know. It would have felt like rubbing something. I just stayed there. Edmund spent the following week on the phone with Stuart, working through the formal trust documentation for Juniper's support arrangement. Structured clearly, independently administered, entirely separate from the assets inherited by Hugh and Stephanie, the caretaker provision Margaret had included in her will was modest. A year's living expenses, a transition fund. Not enough to fight over if you looked at it with clear eyes. More than enough to ruin a family with, if someone needed it to be a weapon. Juniper was transferred to a specialist in Bracebridge for a week of comprehensive treatment. When she came back to the cottage, the guest wing door stayed open. Dot put a pot of African violets on the windowsill because she said the room needed something alive in it. She was absolutely right. One evening in early November, Hugh and I sat on the dock watching the lake go dark. The birches had lost most of their leaves by then. The water was glassy and cold and still. He said, I keep thinking about Mom. That she sat in that room and she knew. That she made a decision to ask Dad to do something nearly impossible and trusted that he would. He kept the promise, I said. Badly, Hugh said, and almost smiled. He kept it very badly. But he kept it. He was quiet for a while. Then, I should have trusted him more, from the beginning. You didn't have enough information, I said. I had 40 years of knowing who he was, he said. That should have been enough. Some things don't resolve cleanly. Edmund never asked his children for forgiveness outright. He said he'd been a coward, that the most decent thing he could have done was trust his family with the truth from the beginning, and that trying to control the story had stolen weeks of peace from a woman who deserved none of what she'd been put through. Stephanie didn't hug him, but she started coming back to the cottage on weekends. She brought coffee and sat with Juniper sometimes, just sat, not saying much. That was its own kind of answer. And when the trust paperwork was finalized and Juniper had her own identification back in her own name, she framed a second copy of that anniversary photograph, Edmund and Margaret at the dock, and hung it in the main hallway beside the original. Nobody asked her to. She just did it. Margaret would have known exactly what it meant. And I think, in the way the water sounds on this lake in the early morning when everything else is quiet, some part of her still does.